The general travel speed had more than tripled after the two Deathworlders split off from the group, now using the fast lane walkways appropriate for their size. The life on the station went on below them, out of their way, as they briskly marched on. Some of the higher buildings of the station still stuck up into their peripheral vision, along with the other walkways also snaking their way through the open space at the station. "So, that was an experience, wasn't it?" James asked, after they had walked in silence for multiple minutes. Even though Yrrol had announced himself following James this time, that didn't stop him from always staying just out of James's sight. Of course, James could still clearly hear his footsteps and breathing just behind him. However, an irking feeling of paranoia still urged him to turn around and look at the man every few seconds. He hoped that maybe making conversation would help ease that feeling a bit. Yrrol made a sort of sniffling sound for a moment, and James imagined the warrant officer looking at the back of his head distrustfully, wriggling his trunk a bit while deciding how to answer that. "Well, you don't get to meet the people ruling our world every day," he finally replied, almost dismissively. At least he had answered at all. But that did bring up a good point. "Now that you mention it," James responded, and threw another look over his shoulder, causing Yrrol to jerk his head sideways to better look back at James. The walls of the station were still slowly crawling past them in their periphery, as James showed no signs of slowing down, despite not looking where he was going anymore. "No offense, Yrrol, but why were you there? Warrant officer is a nice title and all, but not exactly one that gets you invited to a meeting like that one. Or am I wrong there?" Yrrol's eyes narrowed at James's inquiry. His fur and trunk shifted with each small hop he made, yet his head and eyes managed to seemingly remain locked on one level as he returned James's gaze. Finally, after a few seconds of staring, he shook his head, making his trunk swing left to right, exaggeratedly. "Honestly, I've been asking myself that as well," he said, reaching one hand up to stroke over his trunk, stopping his movement and bringing it back into place. "It is similar to your situation. I was invited, so I came. When the Leader Supreme asks for your attendance, there isn't much room for questions." That strangely sounded a lot like the truth, found James. Then again, he probably shouldn't really believe any information that Yrrol willingly surrendered to him. "Guess not," James replied thoughtfully. He brought his eyes back forward and looked around. Slowly they were nearing their destination. As using the secret bullet train of the station without explicit permission would be ill-advised, the two would have to settle for the more public mode of transportation presented by the suspension railways. The nearest station had been a 20-minute walk away from the location of their dinner and had already come into view. A wide variety of different occupants of the station, most of them the typical mix of colourful giants of different flavours, was already waiting for the next train to arrive. "We're almost there," James thought out loud, while looking up at the assembly of commuters. "Tell me something I didn't know," Yrrol replied, apparently thinking that James's statement was directed at him. "Water freezes at 0 degrees but reaches its highest density at 4? James complied to the sarcastic request. "I'm sorry, what degrees?" Yrrol asked confusedly. "Oh, I'm just babbling," James answered, and shook his head, sniggering. "You're a strange creature, you know that," Yrrol said, putting on an almost resigned tone. "You don't know the half of it," James laughed, waving it off. Yrrol didn't seem to find that quite as funny as James did, so he felt quiet for a moment, as James chuckled to himself. "But hey, I mean, given where I come from, I think that much is understandable, isn't it?" James spoke back up, stopping his laughter and throwing a quick smile over his shoulder. He had expected this walk to be a lot more tense, however, after having spent the entire day with the warrant officer, as well as people a lot more intimidating than him. James felt adventurous around the small man. "That almost makes it sound like you were proud of that," the addressed commented glumly, and his trunk started to move left to right on his own. "Well, proud is the wrong word," James replied, putting a bit more of a spring in his step and demonstratively lifting one finger up to his lips as he thought. "But I mean, you have to admit, it does bring a certain flow with it. We're both Deathworlders here, you can say it." A rustle told James that Yrrol seemingly shuddered at that, or at least something had caused him to quickly shake out his fur. "Our homes are hardly comparable," Yrrol said, clearly displeased at either being called a Deathworlder or having himself compared to the Freak in any way. James shrugged and brought his hands up behind his head as he casually walked on. "Well, I wouldn't know," he said aloofly. "What is Tshirt like?" Yrrol made a sound similar to a displeased grunt, although it sounded more like a squeal out of his mouth. "All in all, it is your standard core world planet. It has a nice regulated climate, plenty of resources, lush vegetation, and a stable environment as well as biodiversity," he listed off, and it didn't get past James that he was clearly trying to show off how not like Earth his home was. However, in a more dismissive but also slightly meek tone, he finally had to add, "It just so happens to be a lot larger than your usual core world, causing a deadly strong gravitational pull for many species on its surface." So, a Class 1 then, James thought to himself. Barely a difference from any old, normal world. Taking his musing outside of his head, James once again thought out loud, although this time he intended for Reprieve to hear it. "So, you're a Deathworlder and a core welder," he said casually. "That means your people probably joined the community fairly early on, doesn't it? Were there already other Deathworders around at that point?" Reprieve let out what sounded like a single humorless laugh, and it sounded like he turned to look away from James for a moment. "Actually, the term was invented for us," he answered, with clearly suppressed emotions. "Really?" James asked surprisingly, and turned around to look at Reprieve. He had indeed looked away from James for a moment, staring off towards the station's walls in the distance. "When the first Proto-Community Alliance was formed between the core worlds back in the day, it was believed that life could only exist under very specific conditions. After all life discovered so far seemed to follow those rules," he explained, almost somberly and without looking at James once. And while the assumption is probably still true in a way, it turned out that those conditions were a bit broader than first believed when the Sipperslang reached the stars, the first species from a planet that would have killed species from other planets had they developed there, and thus the term Deathworlder was born. It was almost embarrassing that James had never thought about the fact that there must have been a first Deathworlder at some point. Since humanity had joined the community so late, the concept had just felt like it had always been around. "That must have been quite the shock for people on both sides back then, huh?" he responded. And not wanting to linger in fear that he would start to stare at Reprieve, he continued to walk instead. "It was, but luckily that time is behind us now," Reprieve answered, and the tone of his voice made it clear that the topic was over. For a moment James seriously considered ignoring that to keep asking more questions, but the answers he sought could just as well get somewhere else. At least Reprieve did not leave him hanging with another bout of uncomfortable silence, as he decided that a change of topic was a better method of making sure it would not be talked about any longer. "But enough about me. What I want to know is, are you considering it?" he asked, and lowered his voice, his somber tone from before vanishing. "Considering what?" James responded confusedly, and wondered if he had missed something earlier in the conversation. "Well, running for a position in the council," Reprieve clarified, still almost shout-whispering it to James, although James had no idea why the topic would run such a secretive atmosphere. "The election is coming up very soon, so you'd have to make preparations right away." James cracked up at the suggestion, but could just about hold back from outright laughing. "Absolutely not," he exclaimed with emphasis, and shook both his head and his hand to make sure he really got the message across. "I'm staying out of politics. Besides, wouldn't I have to wait to see if the council is reinstated anyway?" Reprieve slightly jolted back at James's outburst and was now hurrying to get back into his old position. "Not as long as there's an empty seat, and as luck would have it, that is the case right now," he replied, once he managed to catch back up to James. "And think about it, the position of a seat in the council is like no other. You could help shape the entirety of the galaxy. And if even the councilmen say so, you have a good chance of actually making it. Doesn't that sound appealing to you at all?" James shook his head again, although more subdued than the first time. "No, not at all," he responded soberly. "I'll leave that to people who understand something of it. I'm sure there are more than enough humans willing to take a place at the helm of the galactic community, waiting in the wings already, but I am not one of them." They had by now reached their get-off point from the walkway, where a network of ramps connected the different walkways with the ground, as well as the railway station in this case. Going down one ramp to the big connection platform, they turned towards another one leading upwards again, but way further up than the one they had just left. They slowed down a bit while walking up the slope, and even in the low gravity, the slight change of effort caused them to breathe slightly heavier than before. As they ascended, an ever so slight change of gravity was just about perceivable as they came closer to the centre of the station's rotation. Between his huffs, Reprieve commented, "That makes one wonder, if the highest achievable goal isn't for you, what do you want out of your life?" It was hard to believe that Reprieve was personally this interested in his life, so these questions were more than likely also part of his mission. However, James wasn't quite sure what anyone would wish to accomplish with that knowledge. "That's easy. Right now I want to keep living it," James replied with a smile. The railway station got closer with each step. "I'm not sure I understand," Reprieve said, and sounded honestly confused. "Like I said, it's easy," James answered, and used his sleeve to wipe some sweat off of his forehead. The uniform was just way too warm for this kind of climate, and by now he wasn't used to that anymore. I've already gotten what I wanted out of life, and I'm where I've always wanted to be. My goal is reached. Now it is about making it worth it. And I'll be a lot happier doing that for the rest of my days instead of getting tangled up in galactic politics. I'll leave that to somebody else. You've already reached your goal? Reprigue responded surprisingly, his ears even perking up slightly at the revelation. Well, most of it, James admitted, paddling back a bit on his pompous declaration, but the rest will follow in time. I'm on a good course. Reprigue made a disregarding sound and shook his head. Sounds to me like you need to set high goals for yourself, he said. It almost sounded like the man was mocking him. James shrugged. Maybe, he mused out loud, walking up towards the station ceiling and smirking. I guess Shada wants to be a captain someday. That could be something interesting to work towards. A quick glance showed him that Reprigue already regretted giving him the idea from the mere thought of that possibility becoming reality. His eyes glazed over for a moment, and he shuddered as his brain worked out the implications of that statement in most likely excruciating detail. Just what is your relationship with that woman? Reprigue finally asked irritably, and a small pause before he said woman made James think that he was originally going to use a different word in its stead. Do you really want to know that? James asked, raising a single eyebrow at the rodent. Forget I asked, Reprigue replied decidedly, just as they had finally reached the top platform where the railway station was located. The big button to the top right first. Wait for the screen to display this field. Enter the code and press the big key with an arrow in it to unlock the screen. Wait for the processor to boot up correctly. Use the mouse gadget to move the arrow, called cursor, across the screen. 2 clicks on the left mouse button activate a program. Activate the program in the 3rd row of the 2nd column. Wait for the program to boot up. Curie repeated the instructions given to them by James in their head as they executed them one by one. On the other side of the table, the rest of the group was going over the earlier events of the day. That is interesting, but if that is true, that might mean we have put the thing in the completely wrong place already, Shada said, after watching Quiz's explanation of the strange state they seem to have found the room of the warrant officer Reprigue in. But I guess we'll have to work with it for now. Going in and getting it now would be way too risky. Maybe we are lucky and it'll pick something up anyway. Curie didn't pay the conversation much mind, as the window on screen was done loading after a few seconds. Looking down at the keyboard, the strange signs of the Irvin alphabet were visible but bore absolutely no meaning to their eyes. They had to go completely off of James's instruction, as well as the few more universally understandable keys while working with the odd piece of technology. Luckily for them, it was still a machine, and every cause and effect was still predictable, even if it lay outside of their understanding for the moment. A change in tone within the conversation made them briefly shift their attention over to it again, although they had already missed some of the necessary context. Weird. To me that sounds exactly like something happened, Shada said, sounding irritated and fixing more with a distrustful gaze. You do know that hiding something from me could get us all into some serious trouble. Curie didn't like the way the conversation got louder, so they quickly concentrated back on the screen in front of them instead, while also slightly lowering the sensitivity of their auditory sensors. The interface of the program showed multiple interactable fields in a light blue. On them there was text, most likely describing what each field's function was. Luckily, as if the program was made to be able to be worked by someone who does not speak the same language as the one it was made in, each field was also marked with small, abstract depictions of their functions. It was slightly odd to figure out what each one was meant to portray. One depicting a camera was fairly obvious. However, another one depicting a strange, cone-shaped object with a square at its tip and tipped over on its side was less clear. Although their curiosity was piqued, and they could not wait to study each of the program's different functions later, right now the only field they had to worry about was the one that James had shown them earlier, marked with a depiction showing something like waves radiating out from one single point in 2 directions, an inaccurate yet effective for its purpose depiction of electromagnetic waves. Clicking on the field, the window portraying the program changed into a different one, portraying yet another different set of fields. Humans apparently enjoyed breaking down even menial tasks into their simplest varieties. Curie kept following the path that had been laid out for them beforehand, until they reached the command window they would have to use for their task. And you were just going to keep that from me? Shada said, loud enough that Curie could hear her despite the lowered audio sensitivity, and brought her hands down onto the table while looking at Moore and Pippa angrily. What? Did you want us to find out the hard way? Some of the symbols visible on screen in long, seemingly random strings matched with the symbols visible in a single row of keys on the keyboard, apart from dots in between them. Most of them were greyed out and had a red X above, just as grey bars next to them. However, 2 of them were coloured in, the bars next to them being coloured a bright green. It was a fairly intuitive system of showing which connections would be available to the user. One of the connections had to be the gadget, while the other would connect the computer to James's assistant, which he strangely insisted on calling a phone despite it clearly being a computer, just as the one they were using right now. "See, this is exactly why we didn't tell you," Pippa protested against Sheda's agitated expressions. "We knew you'd get all riled up about that." "What do you mean?" Sheda responded, just as riled up as Pippa feared she would be. "I wouldn't have to get angry if you would have just told me in the first place." The two not grayed out codes had differing lengths and numbers of symbols contained within them. Hovering the cursor over either of them caused a white information window with black writing within it to pop up that Curie could sadly not decipher. However, they remembered that the code for the phone included fewer characters than the one for the device, so they quickly figured out which of the options to choose. Immediately after clicking the interactable field, it changed its colour to a lighter version of the previous one, and the cursor transformed into a spinning symbol, while a new grayed out bar appearing on the top right of the program's window slowly filled with a green colour, so the program visualised its progress in loading its applications to the user. Curie tilted their head at that. Even if it was minimal, divulging processing power of the device towards giving completely useless status updates to the user seemed like a waste. They wondered why the human programmers would integrate such a feature, since they clearly had to know that as well. While the bar slowly filled, probably taking longer due to the non-native nature of the device it had to connect to, Curie looked up from the screen, returning their auditory sensitivity to its normal levels. "Look, we get it, we messed up," Pippa was just saying. Curie had apparently missed some more context of the conversation, as Sheda seemed pondering while Moore was breathing heavily, and Chris had moved closer to the middle of the table, and seemingly tried to appear taller than usual. Also, the conversation had seemingly returned to more acceptable volumes. "Well, as long as you know that much," Sheda said without looking up at Pippa, keeping her hand in front of her mouth while talking and looking to the ground. "Anyway, are you sure that is what he said, Moore? Because it sounds mighty suspicious to me." "You think so?" Moore said ruminatively, and brought one of her big claws to her neck. "It all sounded fairly natural to me." "That is because you're about as cunning as a plush toy," Sheda replied. "You know, a simple yes would have been enough," Pippa commented on Sheda's reply. Curie lowered their eyes onto the screen again. The cursor had returned to its previous form. The filling bar had apparently disappeared after it had been completely filled up, and was replaced by a new window opening within the program window. Windows and fields appeared to be the preferred form for any underlying function in human programs, or maybe it was a quirk of this particular programmer who developed this program, leaving his signature in its function. The window itself showed nothing but a dark blue screen surrounded by a grey frame, on the top right of which was an interactable red button, showing an X was visible. A similar frame surrounded nearly all windows that opened on the computer. Curie had observed it before in the program James used to play the movie. And in the middle of the dark blue screen there was a white, isosceles triangle, its tip pointing towards the right side of the screen. Another symbol Curie already knew. It symbolized play footage among the Earth symbols. Curie wondered why such an odd shape was chosen for such a meaning, as they could see no correlation between the shape and its function. However, as everything when it came to humanity seemed to be, at least it was standardized, and easy to discern given a bit of practice or explanation. Curie double-clicked on the button. For a second it got bigger and disappeared from the screen, but was then immediately replaced by two white bars appearing on screen, which also got bigger for a moment, before disappearing, just like the play symbol, which promptly took its old place once more. At least the dark blue screen had been replaced with a single still frame of the footage the camera within the device had picked up. However, they were going to need more than that. Curie tilted their head at the program's odd behaviour and double-clicked the play button again. The same thing happened with the symbols appearing for split seconds before returning to its old status, although it was again showing a single new frame of the camera's feed. What was happening? 2 clicks meant execute with this computer, so why wasn't it executing? They would have to figure it out. Testing the double-click a few more times resulted in the same result, so the effect was reproducible, meaning it was most likely not a mistake but intended. Curie tilted their head again, this time in the other direction. 2 clicks meant execute. 2 clicks caused the program to display footage very shortly before pausing it again. Was that the intended function of the program? Was it maybe an error in the programming? However, they did not know the language used for this program, and even if they did, they could not work with the symbols on the keyboard at all. And they didn't know how to enter the program's code to fix any possible mistakes. But they still had to get it to run. That was their only task right now. They had to figure it out. Using the red X at the top of the window, they closed the subroutine of the program and reopened it shortly after. They then tried the double-click again, same reaction. They closed the entire program, again reopening it shortly after and maneuvering back to the window they were previously on. Same reaction. Curie started to slightly swing in place. The next step was to restart the entire computer. Hopefully the machine was quick and it wouldn't take long. Once the screen had turned black once more, Curie could hear the conversation once again for a moment. "Mincing my words won't solve that either," Sheila said forcefully, and her tail started to sway around. Pippa, who had by now straightened up to her full height, replied, "It certainly wouldn't hurt. Besides, to just not say something entirely unnecessary is not mincing words." Curie swayed around stronger. They had to finish their task. The computer booted back up. They entered the code again. The orientation screen booted back up. Double-click the program. Double-click the field with the radio wave symbol. Double-click the next field. Then they arrived back at the codes indicating the different devices. Double-click the code of the device. The bar reappeared and only slowly started to fill. "Why don't we all step back and cool off for a moment?" Moore suggested, bringing her huge arms up to make calming gestures. Both Pippa and Sheila looked at her agitatedly and seemingly wanted to reply something. However, the bar had once again filled and been replaced with the window, with a replay button. Quickly, Curie double-clicked it. Same effect. Curie's body tension dropped, causing them to slightly slump down, putting their face away from the screen a little, and they started to sway harder. They double-clicked it again and again, always to the same result. More swaying. By now they were bruising their brain, trying to find different solutions to the problem, however their brain didn't give them any. If it was one of their usual technical or programming problems, they would have a variety of things to try and find the problem, but in this case they weren't even sure what the problem was. Double-click meant execute with this computer, so why did it just not work? Their arms and legs began to tremble as they pulled them closer to their body in their sways and could feel themselves losing their grip on the mouse. However, a voice right next to their face reached through to them. "And what are you swaying around for?" Sheila, whose face had suddenly appeared out of nowhere and curiously looked at the screen of the computer, asked, "How's the progress on the camera?" Curie looked at her, then back at the screen. They thought about it. What had made Sheila angry earlier was not being told when things went wrong. Not telling that something went wrong was not lying, but she behaved like she had been lied to. Curie remembered that they had heard of that once. Lying by omission, people called it, and Curie was no liar. "It doesn't work," they stated, their voice ringing out flatly from its synthesizer. "The device doesn't work," Sheila asked dryly, and looked at the screen again, which still showed a single still frame of the footage. "No, it's not the device," Curie replied. "The program doesn't work." Around them, the other eyes of the table started to be pointed towards them. They didn't like that. "Why, what's wrong with it?" Sheila asked and looked a bit closer, as the program showed no error that would be obvious to her. Curie took a tight grip of the mouse and demonstrated. "I don't know," they said, bringing the cursor up to the play button. "Double-clicking means execute, but every time I tell the program to execute, it just does this." With that, they double-clicked, showing the irritating swapping of symbols correlating with the switching of the still frame. Sheila said, and looked at the problem for a second. Then, without saying another word, she reached across Curie for the mouse, causing Curie to pull their leg, which they were using to manipulate the device with, back. Sheila brought the cursor back onto the button, and clicked the mouse a single time. As always, the button grew in size for a moment and then faded out. However, the rest of the effect remained missing. Instead, the program started to properly execute the plane of the footage, the camera feed running as a smooth, constant video, even though nothing in the feed actually changed. "There we go," Sheila said, putting her hand back and crossing her arms. "Crystal clear." Curie looked at the flawlessly running program in disbelief. "But why?" they whispered, as the program suddenly executing with a single click after a double click had meant execute in every previous window. Made no sense. "I don't know," Sheila said, lifting her shoulders and leaning back a bit, "but it works now, so don't worry about it." Then she leaned back forward to take a closer look at the video. "Although we probably won't be seeing anything as long as they are still out, I guess," she added with a sigh. But Curie was not just yet ready to let it go. A single click had sufficed where a double click meant execute. Testing a hypothesis, Curie reached for the mouse and gave the screen another single click. Immediately, the two bars appeared for a moment before fading out and the time froze, before the large play button appeared in its middle once again. And another click caused it to play again. So instead of a double click commanding the program to run, process, play video feed, It instead just changed the already running progress of the program from play feed to pause feed. In hindsight, it was fairly obvious, but why had James told them that a double click meant execute then? Following a hunch they had, Curie now also reached for the largest button on the computer's keyboard. "The movie is started with this button. Want to be the one to do it when it's time?" James had said, back then. And just as it had started the movie, the large button also changed the state of the program from playing to pausing, just like a mouse click did. So not only was the function different, but it was also routed to different controls. Just what was the human who had programmed this thing? Everything about human design was usually fixated on intuitive controls, so why this diversion from the norm? "You done?" Shada asked from behind them, after she had watched them experiment with the controls for a while. "I have to figure it out," Curie mumbled, while they decided how best to follow an alien's thought process in designing such an application. "Right," Shada said dismissively, before leaning her face in towards Curie's again. "But we are supposed to watch that right now, and we can't do that with you pausing it every few seconds. So you'll have to figure it out later. Maybe James can explain it to you once he gets back." Curie looked up at her, tilting their head. "Right," they said, and remembered that they were only borrowing the computer from James. It wouldn't be right to do anything with it that he would not want. Shada took the liberty of picking the portable computer up and bringing it over to the rest of the group, indicating for Curie to follow after her. Now everyone crowded around, trying to get a good view of the tiny screen. However, the footage still showed the same thing it had always shown, paused or not paused, an empty room. "Well, then again, I guess we don't need to all sit around and watch nothing happening all day," Shada said, dully, after a few minutes of watching the eventless footage. "No point in all of us wasting our lives." "And is this you volunteering to be the one wasting yours?" Moore asked the much smaller woman with a strangely distrustful look. Pippa also looked at the Miat similarly. Only Chris seemed to see no problem with what she was saying. "Well, one of us has to do it, and I'm not going to let any of you run around with James's computer," Shada replied in a sharp tone. "So you can run along. I'll let you know if anything comes up." However, none of them seemed willing to just go away to Curie. "And what makes you think we are not trustworthy enough to handle James's computer?" Moore responded to the smaller woman loudly. "Yeah, what do you mean you won't let us run around with it?" Pippa supported the older woman. She'd made that smacking sound with her tongue she so often made. "Well, if either of you has it, I'd constantly have to be afraid of it being stolen somewhere. You're not the most attentive after all," Shada said with a strange smile on her face. That didn't quite match what she had just said, found Curie. "Also, I literally live with James right now. There is also that." "And how do we know you're not going to break it?" Pippa replied to Shada, and stomped one of her feet on the ground. "You're not the most careful after all." Shada gave her a dark glare. "I am more than careful enough," she said explicitly. "Also, this thing was made for humans. It's designed for people like me. How are you two even going to use it with your giant hands?" At that, Moore spoke up, loudly shaking out her fur beforehand. "Oh, come now, we just have to watch the screen," she said, with a rough voice, and kept shaking her head. "Besides, both of us are used to precision in our work. We have to do everything very precisely after all." Curie was confused. Hadn't they just called the task of watching the feed as wasting one's life? Why were they now fighting over doing it? Not wanting the fight to continue, and also feeling the need to point out some inaccuracies in their assessment of the situation, Curie spoke up. "Actually, it should be me who observes the computer, not any of you." All eyes at the table shot towards Curie, as they candidly looked back at their company. As everyone had seemingly lost their voice for a moment, it was Chris who replied to them first. "What makes you say that?" they signed, and interestedly tilted their heads sideways. "James entrusted the computer to me. I was the one he told how to use it," they stated matter-of-factly, as they didn't want to seem like they were merely joining the fight. James had given the computer to Shada, but with the explicit purpose of handing it over to them, so it was on them to fulfill this task. "I am also the only one who knows the code to reactivate it, should it be shut off for any reason at any point. Besides, I do not mind watching the footage until James returns. I do not see it as a waste of time." "Well, that is..." Moore started, but apparently couldn't find any more words than that. "Yeah, I got nothing," Pippa agreed, and stroked some of her fur that had become slightly dishevelled back into place. "Well, I can't exactly leave you alone with it either," Shada mumbled, leaning her cheek on one of her hands, which slightly slowed her speech. Agitatedly, Moore turned towards Shada again. "You cannot be serious right now," the large woman boomed at Shada. "Do you really think you could do a better job than Curie in this case? I am sure they would not leave it out of their sight." Shada audibly sighed at that and just slightly tilted her head towards Moore instead of looking at her straight on. "Come off it, Grandma, that's not what I meant," she said dismissively, apparently lacking either energy or drive to start a more passionate argument again. "What I mean is I can't leave Curie alone, period. I figured they'd stay around anyway, exactly because James gave the computer specifically to them." "You can't leave Curie alone?" Pippa piped up, looking at Shada confusedly. "Why?" "It is merely a precaution," Curie answered in Shada's stead. "She and James figured today may be an especially dangerous day for me." "And why's that?" Quiz asked, their head tilting to a different side this time, as everyone's gaze turned into a concerned one. "Call it paranoia," Shada answered this time, stretching as she spoke. "But with James being officially ordered away, we felt it might be an opportune time for anyone looking for a chance to get at Curie, so we wanted to tighten the security a bit. I know it doesn't make much sense, but it is what we decided on, just to be safe." "And you did not tell us about that," Moore said indignantly, her eyes and nostrils widening at the revelation. Shada sank back down into her previous position. "I told you the part of the plan you were involved with. Watching Curie is on me, not on you. No point in worrying you with stuff like that when you get anxious so easily," she replied listlessly. There it was again, line by omission. Shada had been doing it herself. Then again, they already knew Shada didn't mind lying. "Well now, we can't leave you alone. What if something happens?" Pippa burst out agitatedly, one of her feet now rhythmically stomping the ground. Shada looked at her incredulously. "Think about it. Do you actually want to be around when something happens?" she asked, unbelievingly. Had Curie been so inclined, they might also have noticed a hint of mockery in Shada's voice. But the question did seem to make Pippa think. Who, however, answered immediately was Moore. "No, I do not. However, that does not mean I can just leave after having heard that," the large woman said, and decidedly walked around the table to sit back down at her previous position. "Sometimes we have to do things that we do not wish to do." Pippa nodded comfortingly and did the same. Quiz, who it seemed to Curie had never had any intentions of leaving in the first place, merely remained in place, looking towards them curiously. Curie settled down at the table, passively looking at everyone one after another. It seemed everyone was staying. Earlier everyone said it would be a waste of time. Then they had fought over who would stay, and now everyone stayed. Curie didn't understand why all of that had been necessary, even though now nothing had changed from before. "Suit yourself," she'd said dismissively. "Just don't go around whining afterwards. Most likely nothing is going to happen. That's exactly why I'm staying around after all, so nothing will happen." Moore defiantly exhaled heavily out of her nose, as she decided to absently stare at the screen, with everyone else just sitting quietly. The atmosphere at the table was heavy, as the soothing mechanical humming of the computer's fan filled the air. After a few minutes of nothing happening, Shada loudly exhaled, the air forcing her lips apart with a plopping sound. "So," she said, briefly looking up from the computer screen, "anyone can think of something to do?"